Welcome to Preaching to the Comments, a podcast where Princeton scholars answer the internet's burning questions.
Hi, I'm Connor Martini. I'm a postdoctoral research associate here at the Center for Culture, Society, and Religion, where I study science and religion in contemporary America.
Hello, my name is Stanford. I'm a grad student here at Princeton in the religion department. I study Black religion and literature in the 20th century.
And I'm Peter Benson, a PhD candidate in the English department who studies 18th and 19th century speculative fiction and theology.
So today we're going to talk about some of the internet's burning questions about religion and science fiction. And we just wanted to take this opportunity to get a sense for what the internet was thinking about this, and also provide context and reflections from religious studies and literature to work through some of the assumptions that people have about science fiction.
Yeah, because oftentimes people think of science fiction and religion at odds, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So to start us off, Peter, why don't you give us a rundown of how religion typically works in science fiction and kind of tell us where that question comes from?
So looking at Reddit, it seems like there's a lot of questions about religion and science fiction and how the two relate or don't relate. For instance, one of the questions on Reddit is, why do so many science fiction shows ask questions about God? I want to talk briefly about how science fiction can be regarded as an epistemology. And I'm borrowing here from Professor Alfred Bendixson, who's spoken and written and taught a lot on science fiction. And he talks about how in Western culture, there are typically three approaches to epistemology, epistemology being the investigation of knowledge. One of those is science. So empiricism asks how things work. Then we have religion, which deals with meaning and the question of why. And then we have storytelling and the relating of knowledge through stories. And his argument is that science fiction is actually all three of these. It deals with science, religion, and storytelling. It asks how we deal with why in a world concerned with how. So sci-fi deals with value and meaning in a scientific world. Sci-fi is both a reflection and a critique of this world. So I want to turn to how religion functions to apply a why in worlds defined by scientific and technological development. And I'm thinking here in particular of Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Brave New World presents a utopia where civilization is mechanized to remove all pain and suffering from humankind. Human beings are conditioned prenatally, before they're even born, to function in particular ways, to align with particular jobs. There's this drug called soma that people take to help them with pain and to increase their pleasure so that there's no real need to develop fortitude through suffering or perseverance. It's a world that has erased all sorts of friction from existence. So within this world, you have this character named John, who is also referred to as the savage. He is raised outside of this utopia in the wilderness. John the Savage perhaps rings some bells for his similarity to John the Baptist from the Gospels in the New Testament. And what I would say is that he actually functions in a very similar way. He's an ascetic prophet who comes from the wilderness to call out the materialism of society. But he finds it a very bewildering and difficult world to live in, and ultimately, in a conversation with the controller, who's the man in charge of this utopian society, he says,
I don't want comfort.
Then what do you want? Unpleasantness? Suffering? Pain?
Yes, I want all of that. And all of the things you've done away with. I want danger, I want poetry, I want goodness, I want sin, I want freedom.
Put more directly, what you are really saying is that you claim the right to be unhappy.
All right, then. claim the right to be unhappy.
And what you find is you have this ascetic figure who is essentially filling this religious role that ascetics have traditionally done, where you have society perhaps swinging excessively towards materialism, and then you have these ascetics who swing towards the metaphysical and more towards spiritual enlightenment. And by offering this contrast, they offer a critique of society. And so the savage leaves this society and decides to live out somewhat in the wilderness in a lighthouse. And he practices various ascetic practices. He holds his arms out in the pose of a crucifixion until it's excruciating. He flogs himself. He embraces celibacy and poverty. Towards the end of the book, there comes a crowd of citizens from this utopian society. They're curious about the savage and this strange life that he's living. But rather than being mortified or questioning their excessive materialism, they see him merely as an interesting spectacle, and they goad him on into flogging himself. And in the end, the savage turns out to be a failed ascetic because he is unable to influence the society from which he comes, and he ends up hanging himself. I think why this is interesting, Huxley wrote about the role of asceticism and how there was an integrating principle of all being that was very difficult to live out or to understand. And yet he believed that there were people in every civilization and every society throughout time who were able to step out of the conditioning of their society and come to understand and live out this integrating being. But it's very difficult, he says. It's not easy. So the question here is the experiment that the controller is running, this utopian society, is it so successful that it puts society beyond the reach of these individuals who seek to live their lives consistently with this integrating principle of all being? Or can prophets still speak to society? Will they still be able to reach humankind and pull them back from inhuman ways of being?
It sounds like Huxley is saying no.
Yeah, it sounds like he's saying no, or it sounds like he's saying if it's possible, perhaps we don't want it to be possible.
Sure. Yeah.
At the very end of Brave New World, after the savage has hung himself, it describes his feet as moving side to side like two unhurried needles of a compass. And I think what Huxley is doing there is suggesting that with the loss of the prophet, with the loss of a moral counterweight, we potentially lose our sense of what is good and bad, what is right and wrong. So in this utopic vision of Huxley's, it's actually a replaying of a drama that has unfolded itself over thousands of years, which is the struggle between the material and the metaphysical, or between social and spiritual enlightenment.
And science fiction is kind of I guess, would you say like a vehicle for grappling with some of those kinds of concerns?
Right. It offers a mode through which he can model a satire and extrapolate some of the excesses of society as he saw it at his time in a somewhat fantastical way, but in a way that also still rings true to human nature and to the ideas of religion and asceticism.
I guess it's you're not saying that it's the way to deal with these epistemological concerns, but is there something about science fiction that makes it particularly useful for dealing with them?
Science fiction does offer a distance to the reader, and so the story may seem fantastical or technologically improbable, but I think by offering distance, sometimes we are able to see ourselves more clearly, to see the nature of society or humanity in more detail.
Kind of puts us in the position of the aesthetic outsider, the person in the wilderness who's coming in to see this fantastical world, like we're John.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and would we make Joan's choice? Would we choose a world of unhappiness, or would we be lulled into this utopic world of happiness? One of the ways that science fiction provides or grapples with the question of why is also through religious world making and imaging. And I'm curious, Amber, to hear your thoughts on how that might be done.
Yeah, so when we were looking through Reddit, we found a question from user systemroot420 who asks, do you think that God is literally just a dude just walking around up there hanging out? And I found this question so interesting because I was like, okay, like this question is asking us, how do we imagine God? How people imagine God? And lastly, I think like connections to this conversation we're having, how does science fiction help us imagine God? I think the comments and like discussion on Reddit were asking about like whether God is flesh and bone or is God a transcendental force. And I think that science fiction provides ways for us to imagine God. With the example of Octavia Butler's short story, The Book of Martha, she considers how people imagine God through her protagonist, Martha, who's a Black woman who passes away at the beginning of the short story. And she comes to heaven and realizes that God is this bearded white man who's twice her size, like floating in the clouds in a robe. And she's like, wait, like, why are you like this? And so then like God responds and says, you know, you see what your life has prepared you to see. And so I think there, Martha's realizing that how she's come to interpret God is based on what she had seen in her life and what she imagined God to be like from her day-to-day life. And so I think Butler's helpful in thinking about how do people who have been marginalized by society, how have they been able to see God in their lives, but also how has the aesthetic of daily life lended itself to how we imagine religion. And so by the end of the short story, Martha is able to eventually see God in her own image. God starting as like a bearded white man in the clouds who's like larger than her, to eventually being a Black man who's more of her size, to lastly being in her own image, is really powerful for Martha because she feels comfort and familiarity with this being. And eventually, rather than seeing God in heaven, Martha sees God in a familiar place of her own home. Butler is painting a picture of how people can sometimes struggle to imagine God and how science fiction has this role within people's lives to help them see religion when they might not see it in the same way in their daily life.
It seems like what you're saying is that Butler sees science fiction as a tool for offering even a historical corrective.
Yeah, I think that Butler is doing exactly that. I think she's considering the history of Black Christians in the U.S., seeing Jesus and God as white men within art, within media, within like sometimes their own churches, and saying that no, like Martha, her protagonist, can see God in her own image. And so I think that Butler's using science fiction as a tool to kind of counteract these histories of seeing God as only a white man, but then offering us something more to think about how do we see God in our daily life.
It's interesting that both of the works that you have talked about are invoking a kind of historical precedent in this genre that is so heavily associated with futurity and the future. And I think it's interesting that, you know, particularly the Book of Martha example, right, like so clearly is rooted in a particular history. Yeah, like how do you see the like role of the past in these kinds of works? Is religion something that like maybe connects the past to the future in these, you know, retellings or tellings?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of writers, they're writing in a certain time and place of their own life, but they're also writing it with awareness of the past. And so when they're writing about the future, about speculative futures, they're still tied to their own experiences. And I think of the example of the film Neptune Frost, which is an Afrofuturist musical romance about Colton miners in Africa who become a anti-colonial hacking collective, that they challenge Western society's obsession with technology and its over-reliance on the exploitation of African labor, economies, and bodies. And I think the film is very interesting because it critiques capitalism and colonialism and gender binaries, as well as like labor exploitation. But it mainly critiques the past and how these things came to be.
Mountains destroyed, iPhone on. Nobody knows I'm not alone.
These critiques come through dreams that protagonists have through this figure called Wheelman, who in some ways is a prophet that resembles the biblical story of Ezekiel, who has dreams. And so I think that these dreams enable the characters to question different institutions that they take for granted, like the history of the bank or the existence of institutional slavery. And so I think that the past is very much tied to how the characters are seeing the present and their futures within this like Afrofuturist drama. And so I think that, you know, the film is ultimately a critique of the past and how we can move forward and what the future might hold for different groups of people. But I think that some of the most powerful lines from the film are about truth not being imprisoned in a book, and that technology is only a reflection of ourselves. And the film helps us through science fiction, like critique kind of the past that we are given, but also helping us imagine a future that's not necessarily in a book.
Interestingly, we've talked about prophets and how science fiction uses these sorts of characters that we see in the Bible or that we see in Christian tradition or other traditions to continue to play this role of societal correction, but also of envisioning and seeing alternate ways of being. Then also with the Book of Martha, like science fiction that is almost explicitly theological. It can also be a thought exercise in how to think about the nature of God.
Yeah, I think science fiction is a very helpful tool in thinking about what are things that we want out of our lives, or what are things that we want to see in them, and what is that relationship to how we imagine the world in living. What I think Butler gets at with the Book of Martha and the creators of Neptune Frost are getting at is that while we can imagine and should imagine a different world, ultimately these worlds are based upon ourselves and our own imaginations and experiences in the world. And I think that also helps us think about technology and its use within imagining religion otherwise.
So I found a bunch of Reddit questions that I really loved and I thought were very productive. They're coming mostly out of like subreddits about writing science fiction. Kind of the emblematic one that I saw was a Redditor asking, why do so many spacefaring futures bend towards atheism? Why in so many of these spacefaring futures there seems to be perhaps not like an active identification with atheism, but an absence of religion as we think of it today. Institutions, rituals, different modes of transcendence and accessing the divine. And I guess I should also back up and say, you know, when this person asks this question about, you know, quote unquote spacefaring futures, that's kind of like in-group coding to mean the kind of sci-fi subgenre of the space opera. So the space opera is, think like Star Trek, you know, it is people on ships, it is going out faster than light travel, exploring planets, aliens, that kind of a thing. And typically in, you know, space operas, you have these large kind of governing institutions. You know, Star Trek, the Federation of Planets, is a really good example of this kind of structure that often repeats itself in space operas. This quality or perceived quality to the space opera has a lot to do with what we in religious studies call disenchantment, or the history of secularism. So disenchantment is an idea that was offered in 1917 by a German sociologist named Max Weber, who gave a lecture in which he claimed that because of science's capacity to make all of the mysterious and invisible forces in our world into calculable realities with predictable causes and effects according to natural law. So this theory of disenchantment, this has been heavily criticized. Right. So this Redditor is making an assumption that, yes, in the future, there will be less religion because religion will simply be less possible because of scientific knowledge. And, the kind of pinnacle of science and technological development being the world depicted in the space opera. So I'm going to talk about another, big science fiction property that doesn't just kind of continue to depict religion into a spacefaring future, but does so in a particular way. And is perhaps because of the assumption that I think motivates the initial questioner, this assumption that science and technology are related to secularism. It's probably kind of against that kind of assumption that these writers and creators are arguing, because religion just doesn't seem to go anywhere. So I'm going to talk about Dune, the series of novels by Frank Herbert, continued by his son, and a famous David Lynch adaptation, and an even more famous and certainly more critically acclaimed version directed more recently by Denis Villeneuve. So in the Dune universe, you have this galactic empire, right? The empire of the known universe. Most of that empire ascribes to a form of religious practice that is roughly equivalent with like a contemporary Unitarian Universalism, where like every bit of religion has some truth to it and things from Earth have kind of maintained into the future. And that is true, I think, for like the common folks of the empire. When you get kind of higher up into the echelons of the empire, you start to find kind of other religious interests at play, particularly the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, which kind of acts as this religious order, but is really kind of more of a scientific order. So anyways, there's this, right, kind of galactic religion where kind of every little bit of religion from Earth has been kind of taken and adapted into and maintained into this future. It's been boiled down to this one kind of central religious document, which is called the Orange Catholic Bible. And that's like great, right? Like, when you have a big universalism across many different cultures, you very rarely have any conflicts. There's never any wars. How, advanced and wonderful it is to have this like perfectly packaged little religion. And that's contrasted purposefully in the text, I think, and not just me, contrasted with the religion of the Fremen, the indigenous population on the subjugated planet Arrakis, also known as Dune. The Fremen practice a religion called Zen Sunni, which is a combination of Zen Buddhism and Sunni Islam, as you would expect. And they're seen as very violent, prophetic, charismatic, all these things that are kind of the markers of what we might say is like a bad religion. Like a kind of religion that acts out or doesn't necessarily accord so nicely with this liberal secular worldview, which both like the Orange Catholic Bible and the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood certainly kind of more accord with. The Orange Catholic Bible and its followers representing, right, this kind of like modern sense of, religious freedom and like universal experience, and the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood being this religion that is, very deeply based in the sciences and in genetics. That kind of like prides itself on being this kind of reasoned thing. So Dune creates this kind of comparison, right? This juxtaposition between this kind of like high Catholicism and this Fremen religion in order to use religion as a tool of difference making, for better or for worse, right? We don't need to like the depiction that Herbert made, but that is its ostensible function. And this is a very commonly used tool in science fiction, in the space opera and beyond, of using religion as like a difference making tool, particularly in order to like position people on, right, like the what much older and much debunked anthropologists would call the like chain of being or kind of like the path of human civilization.
So one of the things that we've seen in our discussion so far is how different religious archetypes tend to reappear in science fiction, and we've talked particularly about prophets, religious prophets. How does that play into Dune?
My lord, the great houses have answered. They refuse to honor your ascendancy.
We await your orders, Izan al-Gaib. Lead them to paradise.
Dune has Paul Atreides, the main character in really just the first two books, but he, sees the future. He is both a prophet and a fulfillment of prophecy itself. I was thinking about this when we were talking about, when I was listening to y'all talk about how in these space opera futures, the kind of conclusion of prophecy in a lot of ways is deferred. Like there's a prophet who can see even further into the future. It almost encourages us as the audience. We're already thinking in the future, right? The space opera has already brought us into a far future. It's having us look even further into another kind of prophesied future, which I think gives like another layer of distance, like what you were saying, Peter, in your example in Brave New World, and about kind of the particular value of science fiction in providing this kind of distance as a mode of critique.
It sounds like prophets in these stories are still calling people to re-examine maybe their trajectory, the way things are going. It still has that hint of foreseeing apocalypse or Armageddon and calling people towards some sort of mission or...
Totally. To the spirit of the original question of kind of science and technology completely erasing religion. Like, science and technology are not the mission that people are being called to, especially in Dune.
I do like your point about how, like, the prophets are not necessarily warning us against science and technology or warning us against, like, some form of progress, let's say, or modernity. But instead, they're warning us to do it better and to, like, use it better by being reflective of, like, the past, but also being very critical in how we enter the future.
And that, like, religion is one of the ways maybe that the past is carried into these visions of the future in this really kind of productive, instigating way.
It's a way to ask the question of why, not just how. And so the meaning making that goes into these fictions, these stories, science doesn't tell us this is what you should or shouldn't do. Technology doesn't tell us this is right or wrong, or this is the reason for your being. And so we see religion helping to complement this science and technology with questions of why.
Totally.
And I think that science fiction is, like, very helpful for many writers into, like, thinking about the whys of their lives and the whys of their readers, and kind of imagining religious possibilities that are not necessarily for the future, but also for the contemporary moment.
Preaching to the Comments is produced by the media team at the Center for Culture, Society, and Religion at Princeton University. For transcripts and more information, please visit our website at ccsr.princeton.edu.